The throne room fell silent as the newest bride to be stepped forward, her silk slippers whispering against polished marble. And like all the others before her, she sank to her knees before King Aldric the Third, bowing her head until her forehead nearly touched the cold floor. Vessa Branwell watched from her position near the back of the gathered crowd, her green fingers curled into fists at her sides, her jaw tight enough that her small tusks pressed hard against her lower lip. She had been summoned here along with 19 other women from across the kingdom, all of marriageable age, all supposedly chosen for some great honor that the royal heralds had proclaimed in every village and settlement from the capital to the wild frontier lands where Vessa had made her home. The king sat upon his throne like a bored cat, one leg crossed over the other, his rings catching the light from the tall windows. He was handsome in the way that royalty often was, with features sculpted by generations of careful breeding, his hair dark and swept back from a high forehead, his clothes worth more than most families earned in a year. He waved a dismissive hand at the kneeling girl, and she rose with trembling legs, backing away with her eyes still downcast. "Next," the king said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from never being told no. Vessa felt the weight of eyes upon her as the crowd parted slightly. She was the only orc in the room, the only one with green skin and pointed ears, the only one who stood a head taller than most of the human women around her. She had known this was a mistake the moment she received the summons, but refusing a royal command was not something even an orc woman on the frontier could do without consequences. She stepped forward, her worn leather boots making solid sounds against the marble. Unlike the others, she wore no fine dress, no jewelry. She had come in her work clothes, the sturdy pants and tunic she wore when working her small farm at the edge of the settled lands. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and she carried herself with the straight-backed posture of someone who had spent years learning to be strong. The whispers started immediately, rippling through the assembled nobles and courtiers like wind through wheat. An orc? Surely not. Why was she summoned? This is absurd. King Aldric leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of her. A thin smile played at the corners of his mouth, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Well," he said softly, dangerously, "you are certainly unexpected." "Kneel." Vessa stood perfectly still. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she could feel the sweat beginning to form at the base of her neck, despite the cool air in the throne room. Every instinct screamed at her to comply, to avoid trouble, to do what was expected. But something deeper, something that had been building in her chest since she first walked into this place of marble and gold, refused to let her bend. "I will not kneel before you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The gasps were audible this time. Someone near the front of the crowd made a choking sound. The king's smile vanished, replaced by something cold and sharp. "You dare refuse your king?" "I dare refuse a man who treats women like prizes to be examined and judged," Vessa replied. Her hands were shaking now, but she kept them at her sides, visible, non-threatening. "I do not know why I was summoned here, but I will not kneel like a supplicant before someone simply because they wear a crown." The silence that followed was suffocating. King Aldric rose slowly from his throne, and Vessa saw the guards along the walls shift their positions, hands moving toward sword hilts. This was it, then. She had just signed her own death warrant over a matter of pride. "Wait." The voice came from the side of the room, quiet but clear. Vessa turned her head slightly and saw a man step forward from where he had been standing near one of the tall windows. He was unremarkable at first glance, dressed in simple but well-made clothes, his hair a light brown that caught the sun from the windows. He was not tall like the guards, not commanding like the nobles, but there was something in the way he moved that drew the eye nonetheless. "Gideon," the king said, and there was a note of warning in his voice. "Do not interfere." "She has a point, brother," the man called Gideon said, moving forward until he stood between Vessa and the throne. Up close, Vessa could see that his eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and that his hands bore calluses despite the quality of his clothes. "This entire spectacle is ridiculous. You are not actually choosing a bride. You are parading women before the court like livestock at market." The king's face flushed red. "You forget yourself, Gideon." "I forget nothing. I simply choose to say what everyone else is thinking." Gideon turned slightly to look at Vessa, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no pity in his gaze, no disgust at her green skin or tusks, just a quiet assessment followed by what might have been the ghost of a smile. "You are free to go. All of you are free to go. This farce is over." "You have no authority here," King Aldric said, his voice rising. "I have enough," Gideon replied calmly. He looked back at the assembled women. "Please return to your homes. You will be compensated for your time and travel. I apologize for this waste of your days." The women did not need to be told twice. They began filtering out of the throne room in a rush of relieved whispers and rustling fabric. Vessa stood frozen for a moment, caught between the urge to flee and the strange desire to understand who this man was and why he had spoken up. "You should go," Gideon said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, "before he finds his tongue again and decides to make an example of you." "Why did you help me?" Vessa asked, her voice equally low. "Because someone should have and no one else was going to." He met her eyes again, and this time there was something warm in his gaze, something genuine. "Go safely, Vessa Branwell." She blinked in surprise that he knew her name, but before she could ask anything else, he had turned away, already walking back toward the windows as if nothing of consequence had occurred. Vessa took his advice and left, her mind spinning with questions. The journey back to her farm on the frontier took 3 days by horse. Vessa spent most of that time replaying the scene in the throne room, trying to understand what had happened. The quiet man, Gideon, had called the king brother, which meant he was a prince, though clearly not one with much power or influence if he dressed so plainly, and stood in the shadows during royal ceremonies. Her farm was exactly as she had left it, a modest piece of land carved out of the wild woods at the edge of human settlement. She had bought it 2 years ago with money saved from working as a hired hand on other farms, despite the suspicion and hostility of her human neighbors. Most of them ignored her now, which was preferable to the alternative. She had a small cottage, a barn for her 2 cows and handful of chickens, and fields where she grew wheat and vegetables. It was not much, but it was hers. It was proof that an orc could make a life among humans if she was willing to work hard enough and swallow enough pride. Vessa threw herself into the work that had piled up during her absence, mucking out the barn, checking the irrigation ditches in her fields, repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by deer. The physical labor helped quiet her mind, but at night, when she lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, she kept thinking about gray eyes and a quiet voice that had defended her when no one else would. 4 days after her return, there was a knock at her door. Vessa opened it cautiously, her hand resting on the handle of the knife she kept at her belt. Standing on her doorstep, looking slightly uncertain and completely out of place, was Gideon. He wore different clothes now, practical traveling gear that was well worn, and he carried a pack over one shoulder. There was no horse visible, no retinue of guards or servants, just him, standing in the fading evening light with an expression that might have been sheepish. "Hello," he said. I apologize for arriving unannounced. May I speak with you? Vessa stared at him, her mind racing. How did you find me? I asked. And then I rode for 3 days. He shifted his weight slightly. I wanted to apologize properly for what happened in the throne room, and to ask if you might be willing to talk with me. Just talk. Nothing more. Every cautious instinct Vessa possessed was screaming at her to send him away. Princes did not simply appear at the doors of orc farmers without ulterior motives. But there was something in his demeanor, in the way he stood without presumption or demand, that made her hesitate. Talk about what? She asked. Many things, or nothing of consequence, whatever you prefer. He looked down at his hands. In truth, I needed to leave the capital. My brother and I are not on good terms after the ceremony, and I found myself thinking about the woman who refused to kneel, wondering if she made it home safely, wondering what kind of life someone carves out for themselves at the edge of the world. Despite herself, Vessa felt a small smile tug at the corner of her mouth. You rode 3 days to satisfy your curiosity. Is that so strange for a prince? Yes, Gideon laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise him. Fair enough. Will you at least let me water my horse? She is tied at the edge of your property and probably quite thirsty. Vessa considered for a moment longer, then stepped back from the door. Bring your horse to the barn. There is a trough there, and then I suppose you can come inside for a meal since you have traveled so far. The wariness did not leave her, but curiosity won out over caution. She wanted to understand this strange, quiet man who had defended her before a throne room full of nobles, and then tracked her down to apologize. Gideon's horse was a sturdy mare, well cared for but not ornate. He tended to her himself, removing her saddle and bridle, checking her hooves, speaking to her in low, gentle tones. Vessa watched from the barn door, noting the practiced ease of his movements. This was not a man who simply owned horses but never touched them. He knew the work. You have experience with animals, she observed. My mother insisted that her sons learn to care for themselves and their mounts, Gideon replied, running a brush along the mare's flank. She said that a man who could not saddle his own horse had no business riding one. Wise woman. She was. She died when I was 14. He said it matter-of-factly, but Vessa heard the old grief beneath the words. They walked back to the cottage together in comfortable silence. Vessa put together a simple meal of bread, cheese, and stew made from vegetables and salted pork. It was farmer's food, nothing fancy, but Gideon ate with evident appreciation. This is good, he said. Better than most of what gets served at the palace, honestly. Too much concern for presentation there, not enough for flavor. You do not spend much time at court, Vessa guessed. As little as possible. My brother is the heir, the important one. I am the spare, the afterthought, which gives me a certain freedom, actually. No one expects much from me, so I can go where I please and do what I wish. He took another bite of bread. Mostly I travel. I have estates in the south that I manage personally. I find the work satisfying. Why did you speak up for me? Vessa asked abruptly. The question had been burning in her mind for days. Gideon set down his spoon and met her eyes. Because what my brother was doing was wrong. Because you were brave to refuse him, and bravery should be acknowledged, not punished. And because... He paused, seeming to search for words. Because I have spent most of my life watching people bow and scrape before those who have done nothing to earn respect beyond being born into the right family. It is exhausting. When I saw you stand tall and speak your truth, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Hope, perhaps. Or just relief that someone, somewhere, was willing to say no. The honesty in his voice struck something deep in Vessa's chest. She looked down at her own bowl, suddenly uncertain how to respond. I was terrified, she admitted quietly. I thought he would have me executed. He might have tried. But Aldric is a coward at heart. He performs for the crowd but rarely acts when challenged directly. Gideon's voice carried a bitterness that spoke of long experience. Still, you took a real risk. That took courage. They talked late into the night, the conversation flowing more easily than Vessa would have thought possible. Gideon asked about her farm, about how she had come to settle on the frontier, about the challenges of being an orc in human lands. She found herself answering honestly, telling him about the hostility she faced, the way merchants charged her more for goods, the way children sometimes threw stones at her house when they thought she was not looking. In turn, Gideon spoke about life at court, about the suffocating weight of expectations and tradition, about his desire to do something meaningful with his position beyond attending ceremonies and signing documents he barely understood. He spoke about his estates in the south, where he had been experimenting with new farming techniques and trying to improve conditions for the tenant farmers who worked the land. Most nobles think of their tenants as numbers in a ledger, he said, but these are people with families, with dreams. They deserve better than to be squeezed for every copper while living in hovels. That is a dangerous way of thinking for a prince, Vessa observed, so I have been told. My brother thinks I am wasting my time and money, but I cannot seem to stop caring. He smiled ruefully. A failing, perhaps. Or a strength, Vessa said. When Gideon finally stood to leave, it was well past midnight. He hesitated at the door, looking like he wanted to say something more but was not sure how. Would it be acceptable if I visited again? He asked. I find your company refreshing. And I would like to learn more about farming at the frontier, if you would be willing to teach me. Vessa should have said no. She should have thanked him politely and sent him on his way, back to his estates and his comfortable life. Getting involved with a prince, even a seemingly kind one, was asking for trouble, but she found herself nodding. You can visit. But if you do, I will put you to work. I will not have you standing around watching while there is work to be done. Gideon's face broke into a genuine smile, the first truly unguarded expression she had seen from him. I would not have it any other way. He returned a week later, and this time he stayed for 3 days, sleeping in the barn and working alongside Vessa in the fields. She had expected him to complain or to prove useless, but he threw himself into the labor with determination. His hands blistered from the unfamiliar work of swinging a scythe, but he did not complain. When she showed him how to properly build a split-rail fence, he listened carefully and asked intelligent questions. In the evenings, they sat on the porch of her cottage and talked, watching the sun set over the fields. Gideon told her stories of his travels, of places he had seen and people he had met. Vessa found herself laughing more than she had in years, found herself looking forward to these conversations with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. On the 3rd day, as he was preparing to leave, Gideon turned to her with an expression of unusual seriousness. I need to return to my estates for a few weeks, he said. There are matters that require my attention, but I will come back if you will allow it. Why? Vessa asked. The question came out more bluntly than she intended. Why do you keep coming here? I am an orc farmer on the frontier. You are a prince. This makes no sense. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. Perhaps it makes no sense by the standards of court or society. But it makes perfect sense to me. I come here because when I am here, I feel more myself than I do anywhere else in the kingdom. I come here because you treat me like a person, not a title. I come here because... He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. Because I enjoy your company. Very much. Vessa's heart was beating too fast. She forced herself to meet his gaze. People will talk. If you keep visiting me, if we are seen together, there will be rumors. Let them talk. It is easy for you to say that. You are a prince. I am an orc trying to survive in a world that barely tolerates my existence, if people think we are. She could not quite bring herself to say the word. If they think there is something between us, it could destroy everything I have built here. Then I will be more careful about how I come and go. I will not draw attention to your farm. Gideon took a step closer, and Vessa found she could not make herself step back. But I will not stop coming, Vessa. Not unless you tell me you truly do not want me here. She should have told him exactly that. She should have been practical and smart and sent him away for good. Come back, she said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. When your business is concluded, come back. The smile he gave her felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Gideon returned 3 weeks later, and this time he brought gifts. Not jewelry or fine clothes, but practical things that made Vessa's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. New tools for the farm, their handles smooth and well made. Seeds for crops that were difficult to find this far from the capital. A thick wool cloak in forest green that he said made him think of her. They fell into a rhythm over the following months. Gideon would arrive every few weeks and stay for days at a time, working the farm alongside her, sharing meals, talking late into the night. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance between them began to close. Vessa caught herself watching him as he worked, admiring the way his muscles moved under his shirt as he hauled water or chopped wood. She noticed the kindness in his eyes when he spoke with her, the way he always asked her opinion before making suggestions about the farm, the gentle humor that surfaced in unexpected moments. And she was aware, with a mixture of joy and terror, that she was falling in love with him. It was a disaster waiting to happen. She knew this. She repeated it to herself every night, lying in her bed and thinking about the man sleeping in her barn. Nothing good could come from an orc and a prince developing feelings for each other. The world simply did not work that way. But her heart, stubborn and foolish, refused to listen to reason. One evening in early autumn, after they had spent the day harvesting the wheat, Gideon sat beside her on the porch and took her hand in his. The gesture was so simple, so natural, that for a moment Vessa did not quite process what was happening. Then she looked down at their intertwined fingers, his pale skin against her green, and felt her breath catch. "Is this acceptable?" Gideon asked quietly. Vessa knew she should pull away. She should make a joke, lighten the moment, restore the careful boundaries they had been maintaining. Instead, she tightened her grip on his hand. "Yes," she said. They sat in silence as the sun set, hands clasped, neither one willing to move or speak or break the fragile moment. When Gideon finally stood to return to the barn, he brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Vessa," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She could not find words to respond. She simply nodded and watched him walk away, her hand tingling where his lips had touched. The winter came hard and fast that year, blanketing the frontier in snow by late October. Gideon arrived just before the first major storm and ended up staying for nearly a month when the roads became impassable. They were snowed in together, the world reduced to the small circle of Vessa's farm, and something fundamental shifted between them during those weeks. They worked together to keep the animals fed and warm, to maintain paths through the snow, to ensure the cottage stayed heated against the brutal cold. And in the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked, or sometimes simply existed in comfortable silence, reading or mending clothes or preparing meals. It was domestic in a way that felt both strange and deeply right. Vessa had lived alone for so long, had convinced herself that she preferred solitude, that depending on anyone else was a weakness she could not afford. But having Gideon there, Having someone to share the burden of work and the small pleasures of daily life made her realize how lonely she had been. One night, as they sat by the fire, Gideon suddenly spoke into the quiet. "Vessa, may I ask you something personal?" She looked up from the sock she was darning. "You may ask, I may not answer." He smiled slightly at that. "Have you ever been in love?" The question caught her off guard. She set down her darning and stared into the flames, thinking about her answer. "Once," she said finally. "When I was younger, before I left my clan, there was another orc, a warrior named Thorak. He was brave and strong, and I thought we would bond and build a life together. But when I told him I wanted to leave the clan to try living in human lands, he called me a traitor. He said I was betraying my people, that orcs who tried to live among humans were weak and cowardly. We fought, and I left, and I never saw him again. Do you regret leaving?" "No. I regret that he could not understand, but I do not regret choosing my own path." She looked at Gideon. "What about you? Surely a prince has had his share of romantic entanglements." Gideon shook his head. "My brother has been engaged 3 times to various noble daughters, all political arrangements that fell through for one reason or another. I have been expected to do the same, to marry someone appropriate and produce heirs to secure the succession. But I have never felt anything deeper than mild affection for any of the women my brother or the court suggested. They were lovely people, most of them, but there was no connection, no spark." He paused, his eyes on the fire. "I used to wonder if something was wrong with me, if I was simply incapable of falling in love." "And now?" Vessa asked, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the flames. Gideon turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her heart stutter. "Now I know that I was simply waiting for the right person," he said. The air between them felt charged, electric with possibility. Vessa knew that if she reached out, if she closed the small distance that separated them, everything would change. There would be no going back, no pretending this was just friendship or curiosity. She reached out. Gideon met her halfway, his hand cupping her cheek as he leaned in to kiss her. It was gentle at first, tentative, a question asking permission. Vessa answered by kissing him back, her hand moving to the back of his neck, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words simple and absolute. "I have been falling in love with you since the moment you refused to kneel. I love your strength, your courage, your stubborn determination to build a life on your own terms. I love the way you laugh at my terrible jokes, and the way you teach me things with such patience even when I am being slow to understand. I love you, Vessa, and I know this is complicated and possibly impossible, but I needed you to know." Tears stung Vessa's eyes. "This is madness. You are a prince. I am an orc. There is no world in which this can work." "Then we will make a new world," Gideon said fiercely. "Or we will find a corner of this one where we can be together. I do not care about my title, Vessa. I do not care about court or politics or what my brother thinks. I care about you." "I love you too," Vessa whispered, the words pulled from somewhere deep inside her. "I have been trying not to. I have been telling myself it was foolish and dangerous and would only lead to heartbreak. But I love you, Gideon. I love you so much it terrifies me." They held each other by the fire that night, not speaking, just existing in the warmth and comfort of their shared presence. No decisions were made, no plans formed. For that moment, it was enough to simply be together, to have spoken the truth aloud and had it received with joy rather than rejection. When the snow finally melted and the roads became passable again, Gideon had to return to his estates. There were responsibilities he could not ignore indefinitely, matters that required his attention. The parting was painful in a way that previous goodbyes had not been. Now that they had acknowledged their feelings, being apart felt like losing a piece of themselves. "I will return as soon as I can," Gideon promised, holding her tightly. "Write to me. I will leave an address with you, a place where letters will reach me without going through official channels." "Be careful," Vessa said. "If your brother learns about us, I will be careful. You be careful too. If any of your neighbors give you trouble, if anything happens, you send word immediately." They kissed one more time, long and lingering, before Gideon mounted his horse and rode away. Vessa stood at the edge of her property and watched until he disappeared over the horizon, then returned to her cottage and allowed herself to cry. Spring came slowly that year. Vessa threw herself into the work of preparing her fields for planting, trying to lose herself in physical labor. She received letters from Gideon regularly, carefully worded messages that spoke of his work in the south, of improvements to tenant housing and crop yields, but also included lines that were clearly meant just for her. Small observations about sunsets that reminded him of her eyes, or comments about how quiet his estate felt without her there. She wrote back, keeping her letters equally careful, but pouring her heart into the spaces between the formal words. She told him about the first spring flowers, about a foal born to one of her neighbor's horses, about the way the world felt empty when he was not there. In early April, a messenger arrived at her farm with an urgent summons. It was not a royal command this time, but a personal plea written in Gideon's hand. His brother had discovered their relationship and was furious. There were rumors spreading throughout the court, and Aldric was threatening to take action against Vessa. Gideon wanted her to come to his southern estates, where he could protect her. Vessa read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. She looked around at her farm, at everything she had built with her own hands and sweat. Leaving meant abandoning all of this, possibly forever. Staying meant facing whatever revenge the king might devise. She made her decision quickly. She could rebuild a farm. She could not rebuild her life if she was dead or imprisoned. It took her 2 days to arrange things. She sold her livestock to a neighbor who had always been marginally less hostile than the others, asking for less than they were worth in exchange for a quick sale. She packed what she could carry on horseback and left the rest, locking the cottage door one final time with tears streaming down her face. The journey south took over a week. Vessa traveled carefully, avoiding main roads and towns when possible, camping in the woods at night. She knew that anyone who recognized her as an orc traveling alone might cause trouble, and she could not afford delays or confrontations. When she finally reached Gideon's estates, she was exhausted, filthy, and running on pure determination. The estates were larger than she had imagined, a sprawling manor house surrounded by well-tended fields and orchards. She was stopped at the gate by guards, but when she gave her name and said she was expected, they let her through immediately. Gideon must have been watching for her, because he came running from the house before she had even dismounted. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she clung to him with equal desperation. "You are safe," he murmured into her hair. "Thank the gods you are safe." "What happened?" Vessa asked. "Your letter said your brother found out. Come inside. I will explain everything." Gideon's home was nothing like the cold marble palace in the capital. It was warm and comfortable, filled with well-worn furniture and books and signs of actual life being lived. He led her to a sitting room and called for hot water and food, then sat beside her and took her hand. "Aldric found some of our letters," he said. "I was careless, left them in my rooms at the palace during my last visit. He read them and went into a rage, started making threats about having you arrested for seducing a prince, about sending soldiers to burn your farm." Vessa felt ice slide down her spine. "Can he do that, legally?" "No." The charges would be absurd, and even Aldric cannot simply execute or imprison people without cause. But he could make your life hell through other means. He could ensure you never sold another harvest, could have you barred from towns and markets, could make it impossible for you to survive. Gideon's jaw tightened. I would not let him do that to you, so I did something drastic. What did you do? Gideon met her eyes, and there was something fierce and determined in his gaze. I renounced my claim to the throne. I formally removed myself from the line of succession and relinquished all my titles except for Lord of these estates. I am no longer a Prince Vessa. I am simply Gideon Brennan, a minor noble with land in the south. Vessa felt the world tilt beneath her. You gave up being a prince. For me. Without hesitation, Gideon said. That title never meant anything to me beyond burden and expectation. But you, Vessa, you mean everything. I would give up 100 thrones if it meant being able to build a life with you. Your brother must be furious. Actually, I think he was relieved. He never liked having me around, never trusted that I would not try to claim power. Now I am no threat to him, and he can forget I exist. Gideon squeezed her hand. The point is, we are free now. I am no longer bound by the expectations of the royal family. We can be together without scandal or danger. Can we? Vessa asked, her voice breaking. Gideon, I am still an orc. Your tenants, your neighbors, they will not accept me. They will treat you differently because you chose to be with me. Some of them will, yes. Some people are small-minded and cruel, but many others will not care, or will learn not to care once they see that we are happy. He brought her hand to his lips. And I will be happy, Vessa. As long as I have you, I will be happy. They sat together in silence for a long moment, Vessa trying to process everything that had happened. Gideon had given up his position, his title, his place in the world, all for her. The enormity of the sacrifice made her chest ache. What if you regret it? She asked quietly. What if years from now you look at me and wish you had chosen differently? Impossible, Gideon said with absolute certainty. Vessa, listen to me. I have spent my entire life feeling like I was playing a role, pretending to be someone I was not. When I am with you, I am more myself than I have ever been. You see me, not the title or the family name. You see Gideon, just Gideon, and you love him anyway. How could I ever regret choosing that? Vessa felt the last of her resistance crumble. She leaned forward and kissed him, pouring everything she felt into the gesture. Love and gratitude and fear and hope all tangled together. When they broke apart, Gideon was smiling. Stay with me, he said. Live here, help me manage these estates, build a life with me. I know it is not the same as having your own farm, but we could make this work, together. Yes, Vessa said, the word coming out stronger than she felt. Yes, I will stay. Integrating into life on Gideon's estates was not as difficult as Vessa had feared, though it was not without challenges. The steward, an older man named Marcus, had been skeptical at first, but he warmed to her after she demonstrated her knowledge of farming and animal husbandry. The tenant farmers were wary, but they followed Marcus's lead, and gradually they began to accept her presence. Vessa threw herself into the work, helping to organize planting schedules, improving irrigation systems, working alongside the farmers in the fields when extra hands were needed. She had spent years learning to work twice as hard as anyone else to prove herself, and those habits served her well now. Gideon watched her with obvious pride, and in the evenings they would walk through the orchards together, discussing plans for the estates and dreaming about the future. Slowly, the manor began to feel like home. Summer arrived with warm winds and long days. Vessa had been living on the estate for 3 months, and she could see the changes her presence had made. The fields were more productive, the animals healthier, and the tenants were beginning to trust her advice. She still received suspicious looks from some, still heard whispers when she went into the nearby village, but it was better than she had dared hope. One evening, as the sun was setting, Gideon led her to a clearing in the orchard where the apple trees were in full bloom. He had set up a blanket and brought a basket of food, and Vessa laughed at his attempt at romance. "What is this?" she asked, genuinely delighted. "A proper courtship moment," Gideon said, looking slightly embarrassed. "I realized that we have done everything backwards. We fell in love and you moved in with me, but I never properly courted you. I wanted to fix that." They sat on the blanket and shared the food, talking and laughing as the sky turned pink and gold above them. When the first stars appeared, Gideon grew quiet, his expression turning serious. "Vessa," he said, taking both her hands in his, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Do not say yes because you feel obligated or because you are grateful. Only say yes if it is truly what you want." Vessa's heart began to race. "What are you asking?" Gideon took a deep breath. "Marry me. Not some grand ceremony with nobles and politics. Just us, and maybe Marcus and a few others as witnesses. Marry me because you love me and because you want to build a life with me. Marry me because when I imagine my future, you are in every single moment of it." Tears flooded Vessa's eyes. She had not realized how much she wanted this until he said the words aloud. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Gideon let out a breath that might have been relief or joy or both. He pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple band of silver with a green stone set in the center. "This was my mother's," he said as he slid it onto her finger. "She would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for pretense or false courtesy. She valued strength and honesty, and she would have seen those qualities in you immediately." Vessa looked down at the ring, at the way it caught the last light of the day, and felt something settle in her chest. This was real. Despite everything, despite the odds and the obstacles and the voices that said it was impossible, they were going to make this work. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the estate's chapel. Marcus stood as witness, along with several of the tenant farmers who had grown to respect Vessa. There was no grand celebration, no political maneuvering, just two people pledging their lives to each other with quiet sincerity. Vessa wore a simple dress in forest green, and Gideon wore his best clothes but nothing that marked him as former royalty. When they spoke their vows, Vessa found herself crying, and she saw that Gideon's eyes were bright with unshed tears as well. "I bow to you," she said quietly, the words part of her personal vow. "Not because you demand it or because of who you were born to be. I bow to you because you see me as I am and love me anyway, because you gave up everything to be with me, because you are kind and brave and good. I bow to you, Gideon Brennan, and I will stand beside you for all the days we have." Gideon cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "I bow to you, Vessa Brennan," he said, and it was the first time she had heard her new name aloud, "for your courage and your strength. For choosing love over safety, for leaving everything you knew to be with me. You are the bravest person I have ever met, and I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you." They kissed to seal their vows, and the small, gathered group cheered. It was not the grand royal wedding that might have been Gideon's fate in another life, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. The months that followed were the happiest of Vessa's life. She and Gideon worked side by side, managing the estates and slowly expanding their operations. They started a program to help other orcs who wanted to settle in the region, offering land and assistance in exchange for labor. It was controversial at first, but when the orc settlers proved to be hard workers and good neighbors, much of the initial resistance faded. Winter came again, and Vessa and Gideon spent their evenings by the fire in the manor, planning for the spring planting and dreaming about the future. One night, as they lay in bed together, Vessa placed Gideon's hand on her stomach. "I am pregnant," she said quietly. Gideon went very still. Then he raised himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with wonder in his eyes. "Are you certain?" "I have known for 2 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I told you." She searched his face anxiously. "Are you happy?" "Happy," Gideon's voice broke. "Vessa, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and so full of love I can barely breathe. We are going to have a child. Our child." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and Vessa felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. This was her family now. This man who had given up a kingdom for her, this life they were building together, this child growing inside her. It was everything she had never dared to dream of. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Vessa refused to slow down her work until Gideon and Marcus practically forced her to take things easier in the final months. The estate's healer, an older woman named Catherine, assured them that half-orc babies were hardy, and that Vessa was healthy and strong. In late spring, as the apple blossoms were falling like snow, Vessa went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when Gideon paced outside the bedroom door, convinced something was going wrong. But finally, near dawn, a baby's cry split the air. Catherine emerged with a smile and beckoned him inside. Vessa lay exhausted in the bed, but she was smiling, and in her arms was a tiny bundle. "A daughter," she said as Gideon approached. "We have a daughter." The baby had green-tinted skin, lighter than Vessa's but clearly marking her heritage. Her ears were slightly pointed, and when she yawned, Gideon could see the tiny nubs of tusks that would grow larger as she aged. She was perfect. "What should we name her?" Gideon asked, unable to take his eyes off his daughter. Vessa thought for a moment. "Vera," she said. "It means truth. Because we built our life together on truth and honesty, and I want her to know that is the most important thing." "Vera Brennan," Gideon said, testing the name. "It is perfect. She is perfect." He sat on the edge of the bed and wrapped his arms around his wife and daughter, holding them both close. Outside, the sun was rising over the estates, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. A new day, a new beginning, a new life. Years passed. Vera grew into a spirited child with her mother's determination and her father's gentle heart. She was joined by 2 more siblings, a brother and another sister, and the manor that had once been quiet and formal became filled with laughter and chaos. The estate prospered under Vessa and Gideon's management, becoming known throughout the region as a place of innovation and fairness. More orcs settled in the area, and slowly, painfully, attitudes began to shift. It was not easy and there were setbacks, but progress was made. Gideon never expressed regret for giving up his title. When Vera was old enough to ask why some people called her father Prince, he explained simply that he had once been part of the royal family, but had chosen a different path. Vera thought about this seriously, then announced that she would rather have a father who was present and loving than one who was important and distant. Gideon had hugged her tightly and tried not to cry. King Aldric died when Vera was 7, succeeded by his own son. The new king was less hostile toward his uncle than his father had been, and he sent occasional letters inquiring politely about the estates. Gideon always responded courteously, but made no move to return to court or reclaim any political influence. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Gideon and Vessa stood together in the orchard where he had proposed, watching their children play among the apple trees. "You ever wonder what life would have been like if I had knelt before your brother that day?" Vessa asked. Gideon wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Sometimes, but never with any real curiosity. That would have been a different life, a different Vessa. I much prefer the woman who refused to kneel to a king but chose to stand beside me as an equal. I did bow to you, though, Vessa reminded him with a smile, in my vows. And I bowed to you, because that is what love should be, is it not? Not one person forcing another to submit, but two people choosing to honor and respect each other. He kissed the top of her head. You taught me that, Vessa. You taught me what it means to be truly seen and valued. Vera came running up, breathless and excited, demanding that her parents settle an argument between her and her siblings. They turned their attention to their daughter, to the immediate needs of family and home, leaving philosophy for another day. As the sun set over the estates that had become their kingdom, Vessa thought about the throne room where this had all begun. She had refused to kneel before a king because she knew instinctively that his authority was built on nothing but birth and tradition. But she had chosen to spend her life with a quiet man who asked for nothing and offered everything, who saw her not as a subordinate or a prize but as a partner. That choice had changed everything. It had cost them both, had required sacrifice and courage and stubborn determination to see it through. But standing here now, surrounded by the life they had built together, Vessa knew with absolute certainty that it had been worth it. She had refused a king and found a kingdom of her own making. She had bowed only to the man who had first bowed to her, and together they had built something more valuable than any crown or title. They had built a home, a family, a future. And that, Vessa thought as she watched her husband swing their youngest daughter up into his arms, was worth more than all the thrones in all the kingdoms in the world.